Pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Marshall. As you have seen, Bob is the Chief of Audiology and Speech Pathology at the VA Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. But we're particularly pleased because Bob has been a visiting professor on our faculty this semester, and it has been our pleasure to have him with us. And Bob, we're delighted that you are presenting this evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm real pleased to be here. I've been in Indiana now since about the 9th of January. Fortunately, this week, well, my family are all here. My wife, Karine, has been with me since we arrived, and we've been tolerating the Indiana winter. It really hasn't been so bad. And this week, we're pleased to have our children, Kelly and Jason, visiting us during their spring break from Portland. I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself before I begin. Most of you probably know that academic environments are new to me. I've not been on a major campus like Purdue before. I am plain and simply a working clinician, like many of you who are watching the program tonight. I'd like to share with you a little bit about why I wanted to talk about the fluent aphasias. First of all, I remember when I started dealing with these kinds of folks, I saw my first aphasic client, and I was very confused, very perplexed. The man came in, and I started to evaluate him and grabbed all of my tools and all of my tests and laid them out, and I was ready to go. I had a nice organizational scheme, and I wanted to get some information about the man. And I started with him, and he started talking, and he never stopped. And I couldn't get control of the situation. And I said, well, I want you to do what I want you to do. Now stop this and say these words that I want you to say. And I'll say some words and you say them after me. And I really got in there. And I said, me. He said, there's one. And I said, two. He said, that'll be another one. And I said, does. He said, that'll be one. And I said another word, and he said, whitty. And he went on and on and on like this. I could never get a hold of the situation, and I truly didn't know what was going on with the man. I started laughing, called in somebody else to see what was going on, and that was my introduction to fluent aphasias. As I saw more and more and more of these patients over the years at the Portland VA Hospital, and started reading a little bit more, one of the first things I realized is that there are very few treatment procedures for fluent aphasic clients. There are very few accounts of treatment with these patients. And we just don't deal with them in our literature. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, and I want to explain some of them. But first, I'd like to discuss some of the unique aspects or features of this aphasic population. I guess we could call them a population. First of all, you'll all remember from your studies that fluent aphasic folks are lesioned a little bit differently than the rest of the aphasic clients. They have what we call a posterior lesion. Is that upside down? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to go this way. Okay. They have a posterior lesion. That generally means that they have a lesion posterior to the Rolandic fissure, somewhere back encompassing some portion or all of Wernicke's area. Because of that, these are patients that are unlikely to have any major physical problems. No dense right hemiparesis. As a consequence of that, these are patients that are not likely to be seen by other members of a rehabilitation team. They're not likely to need any physical therapy, any occupational therapy. They walk and get around just fine, but they talk real funny. We used to go through rehab rounds in our hospital, and when we'd pass by one of these patients, the physician conducting rounds would say, "He's here for speech." And we'd move right on, and that'd be all we'd say about this patient. Generally speaking, the pure fluent aphasias have speech as their major problem. Now that brings up another issue in today's revolving door hospital policy. That is that these are patients that are likely to be discharged very, very early. Sometimes they're discharged so early that they're not identified as aphasic people. They're not referred to the speech pathologist for evaluation. So that's another thing that happens. A couple of other things. When we see these patients in the clinic, they are likely to annoy us in certain ways. They're not controllable. They're not programmable. As I mentioned earlier, they're tough to test. They don't want to sit down and go through this stimulus response stuff. They're very agitated about what's happened to them. We can't program them very well. They take extra time to deal with. We have found that in our hospital, in the early stages, they need an advocate. They need someone to speak up for them and look out for them. They're very difficult to write a report about. Sometimes they're suspicious because they don't comprehend too well. Couple of other things I might mention with respect to the demographics of the fluent aphasias. There seem to be fewer of them than the non-fluent types of aphasias, and we might miss them because they don't get referred to us, as I mentioned. Sometimes, however, they get mixed up with other problems. Confusion. Confused patients are one type of patient that sometimes get confused with fluent aphasias, or they get misdiagnosed. I remember one man that came to our service, and he was a very severe Wernicke's aphasic patient. And this man had spent 2 months in the state mental hospital before he came to the VA hospital, and they knew that he'd had a stroke. What he had been doing is he'd been drinking, and he evidently had a stroke. He was in a bar. He was talking funny. He was behaving strangely. They called the police. The police listened to him, and they didn't know what to make of it. So in Oregon, when that situation occurs, they take the patients to the state mental hospital, and if they can, they may commit them there. And this man stayed there for approximately 2 months before they deduced that he had had a stroke and brought him to the hospital. Another thing, these patients have been described in the literature as being older than most aphasic patients. Obler and her colleagues examined the relationship between age and clinical type of aphasia for 167 aphasic subjects, and they found that the mean age for the Wernicke's patients, fluent patients, was 63 years of age, and that for the anterior lesion Broca's aphasics was 52.6. What they noted in their study was that the incidence of Wernicke's aphasia tended to increase with age, whereas the incidence for other types of patients tended to peak in the 6th decade. They speculated on the basis of those findings that perhaps aphasia-producing strokes were more apt to be located posteriorly as one ages, or perhaps that developmental changes in the brain itself provide a different substrate for language at different ages. And a lesion in the same part of the brain might cause a different aphasia at different ages. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the major fluent aphasic syndromes. These are primarily diagnosed on the basis of speech features and the status of the patient's auditory comprehension. 4 speech features I want to just briefly go over: melodic line, phrase length, articulatory agility, and grammatical form. And I won't talk about comprehension. I'll just move that. 3 syndromes I'd like to talk about: Wernicke's aphasia, conduction aphasia, and anomic aphasia. And I'll return to that in just a second. Melodic line, by definition, refers to the intonational pattern that encompasses the entire sentence. If the patient speaks in short sentences, 1 or 2 words at a time, we really can't talk about melodic line. We also can't talk about melodic line if the patient just says the same thing over and over and over again. Like if he says, I don't know about that, I don't know about that, I don't know about that. And that's one of the few things that he says. That's certainly melodic and it's normal, but if that's all he says, we can't really evaluate melodic line. Phrase length, a little easier to quantify. Phrase length refers to the length of the uninterrupted word groups which are set off either by pauses or sentence boundaries. What we listen for here are those occasionally occurring uninterrupted word groups. Things like this will pop out. The patient will say, I don't know what we're going to do about it, but we've got to do something. On the other hand, when you're evaluating a patient like that, he may be actually very disfluent, because as he searches for words and struggles to correct himself, he may not sound so fluent. And he'll, give up on his efforts. Articulatory agility refers to the ease with which the patient articulates phonemic sequences. Here we're talking about the phoneme level, and we may have a patient who is saying the wrong thing, but the agility will be unimpaired. And finally, grammatical form refers to the variety of grammatical constructions, and these can range from one-word sentences to long, rather complex sentences. Now, the 3 syndromes we're going to talk